based on a true story. Those 5 simple words are every horror film marketer's wet dream. Fans of the genre eat it up, watching these movies of misfortune to second-guess how comfortable they really are with gruesome murders and demonic entities, if there's even a seed of doubt that actually, it could happen to us in real life too. Reality is scary enough as it is, after all. But on the other hand, just how liberal are filmmakers with the truth? Most film nuts have heard the real story that inspired Psycho, which would be the murders of grave-robbing corpse skinner Ed Gein, also inspired the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and the Silence of the Lambs. When 3 such disparate real event stories can be, inspired by the same real events, it just goes to show how many liberties movies can take with the truth. These 10 films all sold themselves on being a representation of real-life horror. But just how true are their true stories? Let's take a look, shall we? I am the true crime novelist, Ash from What Culture, and these are the real stories behind 10 based on a true story horror films. 10. The Rite. The Rite sees Colin O'Donoghue's disillusioned seminary student as an apprentice exorcist to Anthony Hopkins. The movie relied heavily on marketing the idea that it was based on real-life observations of exorcisms from previously skeptical journalists, and that its central characters were all based on actual individuals, which for a large part is very faithful to the truth. Taking its inspiration from a book written by Matt Baglio, he wanted to tell the story of Father Gary Thomas. And whilst the spiritual journey the character's film version takes is truthful enough, the exorcisms themselves are far more dubious. Thomas was a consultant on the film and described its exorcisms as very accurate, albeit taking some licenses. However, the memorable scenes in the film are not based on the exorcisms observed by Thomas, but on hearsay and third-hand reports recorded by Baglio. For example, the scene in which a possessed girl coughs up nails does appear in the book, but only as something another priest once told Thomas. Whilst we've got enough exorcism movies out there to populate a whole city with demons, this one isn't quite as scary as what it would initially have you believe. 9. Ravenous. Ted Griffin's original script for Cannibal Outpost story Ravenous was inspired by the Donner Party, who turned to cannibalism after being trapped and starving in the snowy Californian mountains. The Donner Party were a group of pioneers traveling in a wagon train from Illinois to settle in California. Through the particularly snowy winter of 1846 to 1847, the group struggled to make it across the Sierra Nevada. Already low on food from their arduous journey up to this point, they resorted to eating the flesh of those of the party that died from cold and starvation. Apart from the setting and time period, Ravenous' story and characters largely differ. But as more of a case of being loosely inspired by the true story rather than telling it outright, Ravenous also drew on other true sources. Griffin cited 1870s prospector Alfred Packer as a particular inspiration for Robert Carlyle's Colonel Ives in particular. Packer was a Civil War veteran who was part of the group lost prospecting for gold in the Rocky Mountains. Running out of provisions, Packer reputedly ate his companions instead. However, his multiple different accounts of what actually happened, like Ives is in the film, leave some doubt over the truth. 8. An American Haunting. Framed by a modern ghost story but primarily set in the early 1800s, An American Haunting features Donald Sutherland as a landowner who believes a vengeful local witch has sought revenge on him by causing spirits to harm his daughter Betsy. And to be fair to the filmmakers, they do a grand job of telling the story taken from the book. However, despite both the original novel and film claiming to be based on the real legend of the Bell Witch, it hasn't stopped claims that the whole narrative is a hoax. Many have stated that Betsy probably faked the haunting that we see. But even that is probably assuming a bit too much truth in the tale. As it is, there are no written sources for the Bell Witch story before 1886, around 70 years after the events are supposed to have happened. Most of the story's details, meanwhile, are taken from an authenticated account of the Bell Witch written by Martin Van Buren Ingram in 1894. Ingrid claimed his account was based on the diary of Richard Bell, but apparently it was only written decades later during Bell's 30s. And of course, nobody has ever seen said diary. 7. The Exorcism of Emily Rose. A sort of courtroom drama to horror mashup, the film sees an exorcist on trial for negligent homicide after the death of a possibly possessed young woman. Based on the court case surrounding the death of 23-year-old Anneliese Michel in Bavaria in 1976, or more specifically based on Felicitas Goodman's book, The Exorcism of Anneliese Michel, The Exorcism of Emily Rose unsurprisingly updates and relocates the story to modern America, but otherwise claims to be a broadly faithful rendering of the real case. Goodman, an anthropologist and expert in the phenomenon of speaking in tongues, based her book closely on the original court records, but the film is only loosely based on these. The various priests that attempted to exorcise Annalise are conflated in Wilkinson's father Richard Moore. While the film does not explore the fact that Annalise's parents were also on trial for negligent homicide. Both parents and 2 priests were found guilty and sentenced to a controversially light 6-month suspended jail sentence. The film seems to support a religious explanation more than the theory of Emily's epilepsy. While in Annalise's case, even the Catholic Church have since declared her mentally ill and not possessed. 6. Wolf Creek. When Wolf Creek was due for release in Australia's Northern Territory, a court injunction delayed its appearance for fear that it would influence the then ongoing trial of Bradley John Murdoch, whose 2 victims were inspiration for the duo of female British backpackers and their Australian friend in the Outback slasher film. Survivor Joanne Lees recorded how she'd been held up at gunpoint, tied up with a sack put over her head, and forced into Murdoch's pickup. She'd escaped while he was distracted dealing with a friend, Peter Falconio, and hid before eventually being rescued by a passing truck. Falconio's body has never been found, nor his death completely confirmed. Despite these similarities though, the central slasher wasn't based on Murdoch so much as Ivan Milat, the serial killer responsible for the backpacker murders in 1992 to 1993. Milat killed at least 7 young tourists and backpackers in New South Wales. The film's making-of feature has actor John Jarratt describe his attempt to emulate Milat's style by living in the outback and not showering for weeks. For all that there are these parallels and influences though, Wolf Creek's actual story is complete fiction. 5. The Haunting in Connecticut. In this true story, the Snedeker family, fictionalized as the Campbells on screen, reported poltergeist-type activity in their home, of which famous paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren declared the former funeral home's morticians to have been necromancers and necrophiles, and performed an exorcism for the family. The Warrens' role in the movie is taken by a priest, and of course there's a grandiose climax in which the spirits are released through a house full of corpses and a blazing inferno. But the earlier part of the story is a fairly reasonable recreation of the events as described in the Warrens' 1992 book, In a Dark Place, The Story of a True Haunting. The truth behind the book, however, is that it isn't true at all. Most actually written by prolific horror fiction author Ray Garton, it was described by Garton as the low point in his career, as he continues to debate the book's dubious non-fiction status. All the stories he was told to compile in the book were rife with inconsistencies. Garton describes the Snedekers as struggling with alcohol and drug addiction and unable to keep their story straight. He would then go on to say that Ed Warren had told him that all the people that come to him are crazy, and to make it up, and to make it scary. 4. Open Water. Chris Kentis and Laura Lau based their story for Open Water on the real case of Peace Corps volunteers Tom and Eileen Lonergan, who, in January 1998, were left adrift as part of a scuba diving trip to the Great Barrier Reef. The characters of the movie's couple, however, are not remotely based on those of the Lonergans, except for an interest in diving. But the events of the story definitely are very horrifically true. Like the movie couple, the Lonergans were not collected by the boat that returned to pick up their group. Their disappearance was not noticed until much later when their bags were found in the boat, prompting an unsuccessful search. But the fate of the divers is still unclear. The possibility that they became exhausted, dehydrated, and were drowned and eaten by sharks, as happens to their movie counterparts, is the most likely scenario. But theories about their disappearance run to everything from an elaborately staged fake death to a murder-suicide pact. 3. The Conjuring. Claiming to tell a real story of Ed and Lorraine Warren and their investigations into sinister events at the Rhode Island farmhouse of the parent family, The Conjuring rather unusually uses real names and settings for its based on a true story gimmick. Lorraine Warren, who was alive at the time, acted as a consultant and had a cameo in the finished film, while eldest daughter Andrea Perron, who has her own book on the subject, described the film as true aside from a few discrepancies. So the Perrons did indeed move into a Rhode Island farmhouse in the early 1970s and reported it possessed, filled with the stench of rotting flesh and poltergeist activity, and they did really call in the Warrens to investigate. It is also true that the Warrens claimed the cause of the spirit activity was a long-dead local witch, Bathsheba, who again was also a real person, and recommended an exorcism. Have we finally found a true story horror that is actually, really, definitively true then? Well, there is no evidence of this ghostly activity beyond their own accounts, but it is all there all the same. 2. The Quiet Ones. Jared Harris features as the Oxford academic whose experiments on the allegedly possessed Olivia Cook are reputedly based on real scientific attempts to understand the supernatural. In truth, however, the 1972 Philip experiment that inspired the film film was rather more on the fringes of respectable academia. In the early 1970s, a group of Toronto-based researchers, led by poltergeist expert Dr. A.R.G. Owen, attempted to create a ghost named Philip. They created an elaborate tragic backstory for the ghost and sought to focus their collective minds on it to a point where the imaginary ghost would physically manifest itself. Obviously a very loose adaptation, The Quiet Ones mainly takes simply the idea that physical paranormal activity can occur through psychological suggestion, rather than the rest of the real experiment. The results were predictably less spectacular than the film, too. There were no physical manifestations, but in videotaped seances, Philip apparently responded by rapping on the table. Creepy. 1. The Amityville Horror. Of course, the Amityville Horror is the daddy of all based on a true story ghost films. James Brolin and Margot Kidder feature as the young couple moving into a New York house where a series of murders took place. And just for good measure, it's built on a tribal burial ground. No wonder it's haunted. And as for the truth, the film's story is based on Jay Anson's 1977 book, The Amityville Horror, A True Story. While it features the real Lutz family as characters, so many of the events in the book have been heavily and legally debated that it is hard to view it as anything but fiction. The accounts of those involved are consistently inconsistent, with one of the priests involved appearing to be unsure whether he'd even been to the house or not, let alone be slapped by a ghost. For the record, the family that moved in after the Lutzes reported no supernatural happenings and were more bothered by movie fans than the undead. And to boot, they stated that all the fixtures and fittings of the house remained the originals, so there couldn't have been any property damage from poltergeist activity as suggested in the film. And that's our list. What other true horror stories need a dose of debunking? Share your thoughts in the comment section below. I've been Ash, and this has been What Culture. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and always check your ancient burial grounds before building a house on top of them. Thanks for watching.